We are taught that Russia invaded Ukraine for territory, for historical grievances, for the resurrection of empire. We are told this war began in February 2022 when tanks crossed borders. But if you want to understand why European leaders stood paralyzed as cities burned, why their sanctions felt like theater, why their energy prices exploded overnight, you have to look past the battlefield. You have to look at a pipeline map drawn in German boardrooms 20 years before the first shot was fired. This is the story of Europe's energy suicide. It is the story of how Germany, the industrial heart of Europe, voluntarily placed its economic throat into the hands of its historical enemy. It is the story of a war that was lost not in Ukrainian trenches, but in corporate conference rooms where men in suits traded sovereignty for cheap. The tragedy begins in the ashes of the Cold War. The year is 1989. The Berlin Wall has fallen. The Soviet Union is collapsing. For the first time in decades, Western Europe can imagine a future without the shadow of nuclear annihilation. But in the euphoria of victory, European leaders made a fatal miscalculation. They confused the collapse of Soviet ideology with the death of Russian imperial ambition. They believed that economics would tame geopolitics, that trade would make war impossible. This delusion would prove catastrophic. In the early 1990s, European energy strategists looked at the map and saw an opportunity. Russia possessed vast reserves of natural gas trapped beneath the Siberian permafrost. Europe needed energy to fuel its factories and heat its homes. German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, the architect of reunification, saw Russian gas as more than just a commodity. He saw it as the foundation of a new European order. If Russia was economically integrated into Europe, he reasoned, it could never again become an enemy. Gas pipelines would become peace pipelines. Commerce would guarantee security. The first threads of the web were spun in 1993 when Russia began delivering gas to Western Europe through Soviet-era pipelines that crossed Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland. But these transit countries proved to be troublesome middlemen. They siphoned off gas for themselves. They charged hefty transit fees. Worse still, from the Russian perspective, they retained the power to shut off the flow if relations soured. Ukraine alone controlled 80% of Russian gas exports to Europe. For Vladimir Putin, who had watched the Soviet Empire crumble due to economic pressure, this arrangement was intolerable. He understood that control over energy flows was control over nations. The German business elite embraced the Russian partnership with remarkable enthusiasm. Energy giants like E.ON and Wintershall signed massive long-term contracts with Gazprom. These weren't just commercial deals. They were strategic alliances that bound German industry to Russian supply. The contracts contained take-or-pay clauses, meaning Germany was legally obligated to purchase specified volumes of gas, regardless of market conditions or geopolitical tensions. They had signed away their flexibility. They had mortgaged their energy independence for the promise of cheap supply. But it was the arrival of Gerhard Schroeder as German Chancellor in 1998 that transformed this commercial relationship into something far more sinister. Schroeder was a social democrat who believed deeply in the power of economic engagement to transform authoritarian regimes. He looked at Putin's Russia and saw not a revisionist power, but a potential partner that could be civilized through trade. Under his leadership, German-Russian energy cooperation deepened dramatically. State-to-state agreements were signed. Regulatory barriers were removed. The relationship became strategic, not just commercial. The most dangerous moment came in 2005. Just months before leaving office, when Schroeder approved the construction of Nord Stream 1, a direct gas pipeline from Russia to Germany that would run beneath the Baltic Sea. This wasn't just an engineering project. It was a geopolitical weapon disguised as infrastructure. By bypassing transit countries like Ukraine and Poland, Nord Stream would give Russia the ability to weaponize gas deliveries with surgical precision. They could continue supplying Germany while cutting off Eastern Europe. They could reward friends and punish enemies without disrupting their most profitable market. The speed of Schroeder's transformation from chancellor to Gazprom lobbyist shocked even cynical observers of European politics. Within months of leaving office, he accepted the chairmanship of the Nord Stream project. Later, he would join the board of Rosneft, Russia's state oil giant. It was the most brazen example of the revolving door between European politics and Russian energy interests. The former leader of Europe's largest economy had become a Russian asset, using his political network to advance Moscow's energy strategy. As Nord Stream 1 neared completion, American intelligence agencies began issuing increasingly urgent warnings to their European allies. They had intercepted communications showing that Russian energy strategy was explicitly designed to create dependencies that could be exploited in future conflicts. The Americans warned that Putin viewed gas pipelines not as commercial infrastructure, but as instruments of statcraft. Every cubic meter of gas flowing through those pipes was leverage that could be used to extract political concessions. The warnings fell on deaf ears in European capitals. German officials dismissed American concerns as commercially motivated attempts to promote expensive American liquid natural gas over cheap Russian pipeline gas. French leaders spoke eloquently about European strategic autonomy, arguing that dependence on American energy would be no better than dependence on Russian energy. They had confused price with security. They had mistaken efficiency for resilience. The first major test of Russia's willingness to weaponize energy came in 2006, when Moscow cut off gas supplies to Ukraine in the middle of winter over a pricing dispute. European leaders watched in horror as Ukrainian cities went dark and heating systems failed. But rather than seeing this as a preview of their own vulnerability, they interpreted it as a problem specific to Ukraine's chaotic post-Soviet governance. They convinced themselves that Western Europe's established legal frameworks and long-term contracts would protect them from similar treatment. Putin had learned a crucial lesson from the 2006 gas war. Cutting off supply to Ukraine also disrupted deliveries to Western Europe, causing diplomatic blowback that partially undermined his political objectives. This was why Nord Stream was so strategically valuable. Once it was operational, Russia could selectively punish Eastern Europe while maintaining deliveries to its most important customers in Western Europe. It was the infrastructure of divide and conquer. The global financial crisis of 2008 accelerated European dependence on Russian gas in ways that few anticipated. As governments across Europe implemented austerity measures, investment in domestic energy infrastructure was slashed. Nuclear power plants were scheduled for closure without adequate replacement capacity. Renewable energy projects, while growing rapidly, remained intermittent and unreliable. The gap was filled by Russian gas, which became not just cheap but essential to keeping European economies functioning. Angela Merkel's decision to phase out nuclear power following the Fukushima disaster in 2011 represented the moment when German energy policy crossed from dangerous to suicidal. Despite being a trained physicist who understood the technical realities of energy systems, Merkel succumbed to popular pressure and committed Germany to closing all nuclear plants by 2022. This decision, made in an atmosphere of post-disaster panic, eliminated the one major source of baseload power that was independent of Russian supply. Germany was now locked into a future where Russian gas wasn't just convenient, it was irreplaceable. The completion of Nord Stream 1 in 2011 marked a watershed moment in European geopolitics, though few recognized it at the time. For the first time since World War II, a major European nation had voluntarily made itself strategically dependent on Russia. The pipeline could deliver 55 billion cubic meters of gas annually, enough to heat German homes and power German factories without a single molecule passing through Ukrainian or Polish territory. Putin now possessed the ability to hold German industry hostage while maintaining plausible deniability about his intentions. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 should have shattered European illusions about Russian intentions. Instead, it revealed the depth of their entrapment. When European leaders gathered to discuss sanctions on Russia, German industrialists privately warned their government that energy-related sanctions would devastate German manufacturing. They had built their production systems around cheap Russian gas. Their factories couldn't simply switch suppliers overnight. Their competitive advantage in global markets depended on Russian energy subsidies. The very success of the German economic model had become a strategic liability. The proposed Nord Stream 2 pipeline, approved despite the Ukrainian crisis, demonstrated that European leaders had learned nothing from their predicament. This second pipeline would double Russia's direct delivery capacity to Germany, making Russian gas even more central to European energy security. Opposition from Eastern European allies, who correctly understood that the project would increase their vulnerability, was dismissed as backward-looking thinking that failed to appreciate the benefits of market integration. American warnings about Nord Stream 2 became increasingly explicit during the Trump and Biden administrations. Successive U.S. governments imposed sanctions on companies involved in the project, clearly stating that they viewed it as a weapon aimed at European sovereignty. But German officials, led by Merkel, defended the project as a purely commercial venture that would benefit European consumers through lower prices and increased supply diversity. They refused to acknowledge that in the realm of energy security, there is no such thing as a purely commercial transaction. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated European gas consumption as economies rebounded and households remained home for extended periods. Russian supply became even more critical to European energy balance. Gazprom, meanwhile, had learned to use artificial scarcity as a tool of manipulation. In late 2021, they began reducing deliveries to European markets, citing maintenance requirements and contractual obligations. European gas prices skyrocketed, providing Putin with both economic leverage and a preview of European vulnerability ahead of his planned invasion of Ukraine. When Russian troops massed on Ukraine's borders in early 2022, European leaders found themselves trapped by 2 decades of strategic miscalculation. They possessed moral authority and economic resources, but they had voluntarily surrendered the energy independence necessary to use either effectively. Germany imported 40% of its gas from Russia. Italy imported 38%. The European Union as a whole imported 155 billion cubic meters of Russian gas annually, worth approximately 100 billion euros. This wasn't just trade dependency, it was strategic subordination. The invasion of Ukraine, on February 24, 2022, exposed the hollowness of European power in the starkest possible terms. While Ukrainian cities were bombed with Russian missiles, European consumers continued funding the Russian war machine through their energy bills. Every time a German family turned up their thermostat or an Italian factory fired up its furnaces, they were financing the destruction of Ukrainian democracy. The moral contradictions were staggering, but the practical alternatives were limited. European leaders imposed sanctions on Russian banks, Russian oligarchs, and Russian technology exports while carefully avoiding the energy sector. They knew that sanctions on Russian gas would inflict more immediate damage on European economies than on Russian war capabilities. Putin had successfully inverted the traditional relationship between aggressor and victim. The attacker was being subsidized by those claiming to defend his victims. The pipeline infrastructure that was supposed to guarantee European security became the mechanism of European paralysis. Germany's energy-intensive industries, steel, chemicals, automotive, faced the prospect of either shutting down production or continuing to fund Russian aggression. The political coalition that had spent 2 decades building dependence on Russian energy found itself unable to escape the trap it had created when Germany finally announced that it would halt the certification of Nord Stream 2 in response to Russian aggression. The gesture was largely symbolic. The pipeline was complete but not yet operational. The damage had already been done through the existing energy relationship. Putin had timed his invasion precisely because he understood that European dependence had reached its peak. Winter heating demand was at its highest, renewable energy output was at seasonal lows, and nuclear capacity was scheduled for reduction. The war that began in Ukrainian fields had been decided in German boardrooms years before the first tank crossed the border. Europe's response to Russian aggression was constrained not by military capabilities or diplomatic imagination, but by the energy choices made during 2 decades of strategic complacency. They had built their prosperity on the foundation of their own vulnerability. The pipeline war was over before it began. Europe had defeated itself through the accumulated weight of thousands of individual decisions that seemed economically rational in isolation but proved strategically catastrophic in aggregate. They had confused interdependence with peace, efficiency with security, and commercial relationships with political insurance. As Ukrainian defenders fought for their cities and European consumers faced skyrocketing energy bills, the fundamental lesson became clear. There are no purely economic relationships between nations. Every pipeline is a weapon. Every contract is a chain. Every barrel of oil and cubic meter of gas carries the DNA of the political system that produced it. The gas didn't stop flowing because of sanctions. The sanctions were limited because the gas was always a weapon.